Welcome to Cryptid Monologues. Let's dive into a world where myths meet imagination. Here we unravel chilling tales of cryptids, Bigfoot, Wendigos, Dogman, skinwalkers, and more. These stories are crafted to ignite your imagination. These stories are purely fictitious, and names and/or events are purely coincidental. If you like these kind of stories, please give a like and subscribe. Click on the notification bell to stay up to date. Thanks for listening. Let's get into it. French Trapper Story Part 1. A Call to the Rockies. Etienne Rousseau tightened his fur-lined coat against the biting wind as his canoe skimmed the icy waters of the Saskatchewan River. The French trapper, working under contract for the Hudson Bay Fur Co, had been assigned a daunting task: to scout new trapping territories deep in the untamed Rocky Mountains. The year was 1825, and whispers of abundant beaver pelts had drawn traders and trappers. The Rockies were no ordinary wilderness. They were shrouded in mystery, danger, and the promise of fortune. Etienne's journey began at Fort Carlton, where he loaded his canoe with provisions: dried meat, flint, traps, and a musket with just enough powder and shot. He also carried a map sketched from the vague accounts of other trappers, but it offered little assurance. The mountains were an unmapped labyrinth. As he paddled westward, the river's gentle currents gradually transformed into frothing rapids, forcing Etienne to navigate with precision. On the fifth day, Etienne encountered his first obstacle. A cascade of jagged rocks blocked the river, forcing him to portage his canoe and supplies through dense forest. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, but the serenity was deceptive. As he struggled with the weight of his gear, a distant howl echoed through the trees. Wolves. Etienne's heart quickened. He hastened his pace, knowing that dusk was no time to linger. By nightfall, he had set up camp near a sheltered grove. The fire crackled, and Etienne's weary muscles ached from the day's labor. Yet sleep eluded him. The howls grew nearer, their mournful cries raising the hairs on his neck. On the fifth night, the wolves' presence escalated. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness as they circled the camp, just beyond the firelight. Etienne's pulse raced as he gripped his musket tightly. Each rustle in the underbrush felt like a prelude to an attack. He fed more wood into the flames, the growing fire casting dancing shadows that seemed to keep the predators at bay. Minutes stretched into hours as the pack prowled closer, their growls rumbling in the cold night air. Etienne knew he could not let his guard down, yet exhaustion gnawed at him. When the first gray light of dawn broke through the trees, the wolves finally retreated, their haunting cries fading into the wilderness. Etienne's body sagged with relief, but the experience left him rattled and more vigilant than ever. As the days turned into weeks, Etienne faced trials that tested his resolve. Crossing the foothills, he encountered a sudden blizzard that reduced visibility to mere feet. The snow fell in heavy sheets, and Etienne's fingers stiffened as he fought to keep moving. He found temporary refuge in a hollow tree, shivering through the night and praying for the storm to pass. When the skies finally cleared, the Rockies loomed before him, their peaks piercing the heavens. The sight was both awe-inspiring and foreboding. Etienne's journey now entered its most perilous phase. The trails were treacherous, the paths often mere ledges clinging to cliff sides. One misstep could mean death. Midway through the mountain pass, Etienne stumbled upon an abandoned trapper's camp. Scattered belongings told a grim story: overturned pots, a torn bedroll, and claw marks on nearby trees. Bear tracks circled the site. Etienne moved cautiously to investigate further. Inside the remnants of a crude cabin, he found a journal, its leather cover weathered and cracked. The pages within told a tale both chilling and enigmatic. The journal's entries spoke of strange encounters in the wilderness. The previous trapper had written about sightings of a creature, part man and part wolf, that prowled the mountains under the light of the full moon. Descriptions of glowing eyes and unnatural howls filled the pages, along with warnings to avoid certain valleys after dark. The final entry ended abruptly. "I hear it outside. If anyone finds this, beware the beast of these peaks." Etienne felt a chill creep up his spine as he read the words, the weight of the journal heavy in his hands. He slipped the journal into his pack, both intrigued and unsettled. Whether the writings were truth or the ramblings of a man driven mad by isolation, Etienne could not ignore the unease it stirred within him. He tightened his grip on his musket and moved on, his senses on high alert. As Etienne journeyed deeper into the mountains, he came across an unexpected and eerie discovery. On a jagged cliffside overlooking a narrow valley, he stumbled upon ancient cliff paintings. The reddish ochre images, worn by time and weather, depicted a creature unlike anything he had ever seen, a beast with the body of a man but the head of a wolf. Around it, smaller figures, clearly human, appeared to cower or flee. Other panels showed the creature hunting under the moonlight, surrounded by mysterious symbols Etienne couldn't decipher. Etienne knelt before the paintings, his heart heavy with a mix of wonder and dread. He had heard stories from traders and native guides about the Dogman, a figure of legend said to guard the sacred and hidden places of the wilderness. But seeing the paintings brought an unsettling reality to the tales. Were they warnings from the past, or merely the imaginings of ancient storytellers? As he studied the paintings, Etienne felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The wind carried a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo through the valley. He glanced around nervously, clutching his musket. The mountains felt alive, their silence heavy with secrets. Etienne forced himself to move on, but the images stayed etched in his mind, haunting every step of his journey. The suspense reached its peak when Etienne discovered signs of another presence in the wilderness. Smoke curled from a distant ridge, signaling a campfire. Was it another trapper or something more sinister? Etienne approached cautiously, every step deliberate. As he neared, he heard voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Peering through the underbrush, he glimpsed a group of men armed with muskets and wearing mismatched clothing. Smugglers or renegades, he surmised. Etienne backed away silently, his heart pounding. The men were blocking the most accessible route through the mountains. Forced to find an alternative path, he ventured into uncharted territory, where sheer cliffs and avalanches threatened his every move. Finally, after weeks of peril, Etienne emerged into a verdant valley teeming with wildlife. Streams glistened with trout, and the air buzzed with life. He set his traps and marveled at the abundance. The journey had been brutal, but the rewards were undeniable. Yet even as he prepared to make his fortune, Etienne knew the mountains were not to be underestimated. They had tested his endurance, courage, and wits, and they would do so again. As he gazed at the towering peaks, Etienne whispered a silent prayer of gratitude and steeled himself for the challenges yet to come. As Etienne pressed onward, he came across a group of local Native Americans from a nearby tribe. They spotted him first, emerging from the trees with bows and cautious expressions. Etienne raised his hands in a gesture of peace, and after a tense exchange, they approached. One of the older men spoke a few words in broken French, enough to bridge the gap. The tribe had seen few trappers this deep in the mountains and were curious about Etienne's journey. Over the following days, the natives befriended Etienne, offering him guidance and much-needed support. They shared their knowledge of the land, pointing out the safest passes and the best locations to set traps. They warned him about the dangers of certain valleys where hunters had vanished without a trace. Around the fire at night, they told stories of the Dogman, their words aligning with the images Etienne had seen on the cliffs. One of the younger men, named Tahoe, became particularly close to Etienne. Tahoe accompanied him on a few hunts, showing him how to track game and navigate the unpredictable mountain terrain. In return, Etienne shared some of his supplies, offering metal tools and explaining their use. Their bond became one of mutual respect, and Etienne found comfort in their companionship after weeks of isolation. One fateful night, Etienne and Tahoe ventured into a narrow, moonlit valley to check Etienne's traps. The air was heavy, the forest unusually silent. Tahoe paused, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. "Something is wrong," he muttered in his native tongue, motioning for Etienne to stay alert. Etienne's hand tightened around his musket as they moved forward cautiously. A low growl cut through the stillness, resonating like a warning. Both men froze, their breath visible in the cold air. From the tree line, two glowing eyes appeared, reflecting the pale moonlight. The figure that stepped into view was monstrous, towering and broad-shouldered, with a lupin head crowned by ears that twitched at every sound. Its fur was matted, its claws glinting like knives. Tahoe whispered a prayer, his bow trembling in his hands. Etienne raised his musket, but the creature didn't charge. Instead, it tilted its head, watching them with an unsettling intelligence. Etienne's heart pounded, his finger on the trigger. "Back away slowly," Tahoe urged, his voice barely audible. They began to retreat, step by step, but the Dogman followed, its movements fluid and eerily quiet. When a branch snapped under Etienne's boot, the creature let out an ear-splitting roar that echoed through the valley. It lunged forward, forcing both men to scatter. Etienne fired his musket, the shot ringing out like a cannon. The creature recoiled, a dark stain spreading across its shoulder, but it didn't fall. Instead, it snarled with fury, its glowing eyes now burning with rage. Tahoe shot an arrow, striking its leg, but the beast seemed only enraged by the attack. "Run!" Tahoe shouted, grabbing Etienne's arm. They sprinted through the forest, the creature crashing through the underbrush behind them. Branches clawed at their faces as they ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The Dogman's howls grew louder, closer. They burst into a clearing where an outcrop of boulders offered a momentary refuge. Scrambling up the rocks, they turned to face their pursuer. The creature stalked into the clearing, its massive frame illuminated by the moon. Etienne grabbed a powder horn, hastily reloading his musket. Tahoe knocked another arrow, his eyes locked on the beast. Before either could act, the Dogman let out a guttural snarl and bounded away, disappearing into the shadows as swiftly as it had appeared. The forest fell silent once more, except for the pounding of their hearts. Etienne and Tahoe sat on the rocks, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. "It's real," Etienne muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Tahoe nodded solemnly, his gaze fixed on the darkness. "And it will come again." The encounter left them shaken but resolute. They knew the Dogman was no mere legend. It was a predator that demanded respect and caution. As they made their way back to camp, both men understood that the mountains held dangers far beyond the natural world, and survival would require every ounce of their courage and wit. Morning light filtered through the dense canopy of pine trees, painting the clearing in muted golds and greens. Etienne and Tahoe woke with the stiffness of men who had run for their lives. Their muscles ached, and their nerves were still raw. But the campfire's warmth and the soft chatter of birds provided a fragile sense of normalcy. As they sipped steaming mugs of herbal tea that Tahoe had brewed, they recounted the events of the previous night. Each detail felt heavier when spoken aloud. The Dogman's intelligence, its unrelenting pursuit, and its eventual retreat. "We were lucky," Etienne said, his voice rough from exhaustion. Tahoe nodded solemnly. "Luck does not last forever. We must tread carefully now. The land is its domain." The two men resolved to carry on with their work despite the lingering unease. Survival demanded it. With measured caution, they ventured into the forest that morning to check their traps. The first trap they found had been sprung, but held nothing but signs of struggle. Deep gouges in the earth and claw marks on nearby trees hinted that a predator, perhaps even the Dogman, had come through during the night. Etienne frowned, examining the signs. "It's testing us," he said, more to himself than to Tahoe. Tahoe inspected the tracks, his practiced eyes scanning for clues. A wolf would not leave this much destruction. It's not just feeding, this is a warning. The next few traps proved more fruitful. A fat beaver lay in one, its rich pelt a valuable prize. Etienne skinned it deftly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he worked the hide free. Tahoe kept watch, his bow resting across his knees, his gaze flicking between the tree line and the horizon. By midday they had gathered enough to return to camp. The tension of the previous night began to loosen as they worked side by side, their routines providing a much-needed distraction. Etienne set to fleshing the hides, scraping away fat and sinew with a curved knife. The rhythmic motion and the sharp, earthy smell of the pelts brought him a sense of grounding. Tahoe busied himself preparing meat for drying, slicing thin strips and arranging them over a smoking rack near the fire. As the sun rose higher, their camp began to resemble something of a haven, a fragile sanctuary amid the harsh wilderness. Though their hands were busy, their minds were restless. As the evening light began to fade, Etienne broke the silence. "Tahoe, the stories your people tell about the Dogman, do they speak of ways to ward it off?" Tahoe paused, considering. "The elders say it is not like a wolf or bear that hunts for hunger. It hunts for purpose, for the spirit of those who trespass where it rains. We cannot kill it, but respect might protect us. Fires, offerings, and most importantly, leaving no trace." Etienne looked around their camp, at the smoking rack, the scraped hides, and the growing pile of goods they had claimed from the mountains. "Then we're walking a fine line. These traps, the work we do, it's all a trace." Tahoe nodded, his expression grave. "We must finish quickly and leave. The more we linger, the more we invite it back." That night, as they sat by the fire, Etienne and Tahoe laid plans to move their operation closer to the edge of the mountains. While the furs they'd already collected would fetch a handsome price at the trading post, their survival outweighed any profit. The men worked late into the night, fleshing and stretching hides over frames to cure. Their conversation turned toward lighter topics, tales of Etienne's childhood in the French countryside and Tahoe's first hunt as a boy. Laughter, though subdued, returned to the camp, easing the weight of their shared ordeal. But even as they spoke, both men kept their weapons within arm's reach. For in the Rockies they had learned the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was as thin as the mountain air. A reluctant departure. The decision to move camp came with a sense of urgency. The lingering unease from the Dogman encounter, coupled with the fresh claw marks near the traps, left Etienne and Tahoe little choice. The mountains had their rules, and the men had begun to feel like unwelcome guests overstaying their welcome. At dawn, they began dismantling their camp. Etienne carefully packed the dried pelts into a bundle, securing them tightly with leather straps. The cured hides represented weeks of hard work and a lifeline for future trading. Tahoe prepared their supplies with methodical precision, ensuring no trace of their stay remained. As they worked, Etienne paused to study the clearing. "Do you think moving will make a difference?" he asked, his tone skeptical but tinged with hope. Tahoe straightened from where he knelt near the fire pit, brushing ash from his hands. "It may. The mountains are vast. Perhaps we can move beyond its reach, or its interest." It wasn't much reassurance, but it was enough to keep them moving. Rebuilding the camp. The men fell into a familiar rhythm. Etienne erected a makeshift lean-to using branches and pelts, while Tahoe scouted the area for fresh game trails. They worked in near silence, each man lost in his thoughts. As night fell, the fire crackled brightly, casting flickering light against the surrounding trees. The new location felt safer, more remote, but neither man could shake the feeling of being watched. "Do you think it will follow us?" Etienne asked as they sat by the fire, their meal of dried venison finished. Tahoe stirred the embers with a stick. "If it wants to, it will. But here we have the high ground. Fire and open sight lines will favor us if it comes." Etienne nodded, but the thought of another encounter with the Dogman made his stomach churn. The first few days in the new camp passed uneventfully. The men set new traps along the riverbank and fleshed the remaining hides. Etienne began to relax, allowing himself to believe they had left the Dogman behind, but small signs hinted that the mountains were not done with them. One morning they found a trap sprung but empty, the ground around it churned and clawed. Another day, Tahoe discovered a single footprint larger than any wolf's. He said nothing to Etienne, but his silence spoke volumes. One evening, as they prepared to sleep, the distant sound of howling echoed through the valley. It was faint, almost indistinct, but enough to send a chill down Etienne's spine. "We keep the fire high tonight," Tahoe said, his voice firm. They did, and though nothing approached the camp, neither man slept well. As the days wore on, Etienne began to question their plan. The new camp was better suited to survival, but the looming sense of danger persisted. He debated whether to continue trapping or cut their losses and head back to the trading post with what they had. "Tahoe," Etienne said one morning as they prepared their gear. "If we leave now, we could make it to Fort Carlton before the first snow." Tahoe studied him for a moment, then looked to the mountains. "We've done well here, but the land is restless. It would be wise to leave before it turns against us." Their bond, forged in shared trials, made the decision easier. The men agreed to finish tending their traps and prepare for the long journey back to civilization. With the decision made to leave the mountains, Etienne and Tahoe worked swiftly to dismantle their camp. Each passing hour felt heavier, as if the wilderness itself resisted their departure. The claw marks on the tree were a fresh warning, but Etienne forced himself to focus on the task at hand, bundling the pelts, packing the provisions, and preparing their weapons. By midday they set off. The path to Fort Carlton was a daunting trek of over 100 miles, through icy rivers, thick forests, and treacherous ridges. Despite the challenges, the thought of the fort's sturdy walls and bustling hearths drove them forward. For days, they moved steadily, checking their traps along the way and collecting what pelts they could. The forest seemed quieter than before, too quiet. The usual calls of birds and rustling of small animals were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that gnawed at their nerves. On the 5th day of their journey, Etienne noticed tracks in the snow. They were large, canine, but wrong. The toes were too long, the claws too pronounced. He crouched, studying the prints with growing dread. "It's following us," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tahoe nodded, his expression grim. "It doesn't want us to leave," the night stalker. That night, they camped in a small clearing near a frozen stream. The fire crackled brightly, but the light felt feeble against the oppressive darkness of the forest. Both men kept their weapons close, their nerves taut. The first howl came just after midnight. Low, mournful, and bone-chilling, it echoed through the trees. Etienne and Tahoe exchanged a glance, their fears unspoken but mutual. Then came the rustling, soft at first, like the wind brushing against leaves, but growing louder. Something was moving just beyond the firelight, circling the camp. Etienne gripped his musket, his palms slick with sweat. A branch snapped, and both men whipped toward the sound. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, two amber orbs that reflected the firelight like molten gold. The Dogman stepped into view, its massive frame illuminated by the flickering flames. Its fur was thick and dark, its lupine face twisted in a snarl that revealed sharp, glistening fangs. It moved with a predatory grace, its claws digging into the frozen earth. Tahoe raised his bow, aiming for the creature's chest. "Not yet," Etienne whispered, his voice trembling. "Let it come closer." The beast tilted its head, watching them with unnerving intelligence. Then, with a guttural growl, it lunged. The battle. The dogman stood motionless for a moment, its amber eyes fixed on Etienne and Tahoe. Its low growl reverberated through the clearing, a guttural warning that sent chills up their spines. The firelight flickered across its fur, casting monstrous shadows on the surrounding trees. Etienne's pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly drew the long hunting knife from his belt. Tahoe gripped his bow, the tension of the drawn string vibrating faintly in the tense air. Neither man dared to move. The dogman took a step forward, its claws sinking into the frozen ground with a sickening crunch. The beast's breath came in heavy, visible puffs in the cold air, and its ears flicked toward every sound, its senses razor-sharp. "Tahoe," Etienne whispered, his voice trembling. "The fire. Scatter the embers." Tahoe gave a small nod and with a sudden motion kicked at the fire pit, sending a shower of glowing embers into the air. Sparks flew like fireflies, momentarily startling the creature. It recoiled, its head snapping back and forth to track the sudden explosion of light. "Run!" Etienne shouted, but neither man turned their back on the beast. Instead, they edged toward the boulders at the far side of the clearing, their steps deliberate and slow. The dogman recovered quickly, its snarl deepening as it advanced again, this time more cautiously. It seemed to savor their fear, taking its time as it stalked them. Etienne felt his grip tighten on the knife until his knuckles ached. Without warning, the dogman darted forward with terrifying speed, leaping to block their path. It landed mere feet away, its massive frame blotting out the firelight. Etienne's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground, holding the knife in front of him like a feeble talisman. Tahoe acted first. With a sharp cry, he shot an arrow, not at the beast, but at a low-hanging branch above it. The arrow struck true, and the snow-laden branch crashed down, momentarily pinning the creature beneath its weight. "Now!" Tahoe shouted, grabbing Etienne's arm. They bolted for the rocks, scrambling over the jagged terrain as the dogman thrashed behind them, splintering the branch like it was kindling. A deadly chase. The beast's enraged roar shook the forest as it tore free, its claws gouging deep furrows into the earth. Etienne and Tahoe climbed higher, their hands and knees scraping against the cold, sharp stone. The dogman gave chase, its powerful limbs propelling it up the rocks with ease. Etienne turned, his breathing ragged, and hurled a stone with all his might. The projectile struck the beast's flank, but it only seemed to anger it further. It lunged, swiping at Tahoe, who barely avoided the blow by ducking behind a jutting boulder. "We can't outrun it," Etienne gasped, the bitter truth settling over him like the mountain's cold air. Tahoe's eyes darted to the narrow ledge above them. "There! If we make it up, it won't have room to follow." The two men scrambled upward, the rocks slick with frost. The dogman bounded after them, its claws scraping against the stone as it closed the distance. Etienne reached the ledge first, pulling himself up with trembling arms. He turned to help Tahoe, who was struggling to gain footing on the icy surface. "Faster!" Etienne urged, his voice cracking. The dogman lunged, its jaws snapping inches from Tahoe's leg. With a desperate cry, Tahoe swung his bow, striking the beast across its snout. The dogman reeled back, momentarily stunned, and Etienne seized the chance to grab Tahoe's arm, hauling him onto the ledge. But the reprieve was short-lived. The dogman crouched, its muscles coiling as it prepared to leap. Etienne and Tahoe scrambled along the ledge, the narrow path forcing them to press against the cold stone wall. Below, the ground dropped into a sheer ravine, the rushing sound of a hidden river echoing faintly from the depths. The dogman's leap brought it onto the ledge behind them, its claws gouging deep into the rock as it steadied itself. The beast advanced slowly, its snarls reverberating off the cliff face. Tahoe suddenly stopped and turned, his face resolute. Etienne, keep moving. No, Etienne said firmly. We fight together. The final stand, Etienne handed Tahoe his musket, now reloaded, and gripped his knife tightly. The men faced the dogman as it crept closer, its amber eyes blazing with malice. Tahoe, Etienne said quietly. When it lunges, aim for the throat. Tahoe nodded, the musket steady in his hands. The dogman crouched low, its growl building to a deafening roar. Then it sprang, a blur of fur and claws. Etienne dived to the side, slashing upward as the beast sailed past him. The knife bit into its side, drawing a stream of dark blood. Tahoe fired, the musket's boom echoing across the mountains. The bullet struck the dogman's neck, and it stumbled, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. But it didn't fall. The creature lashed out wildly, its claws slicing through the air. Etienne and Tahoe ducked and weaved, their every movement fueled by raw desperation. Finally, Etienne spotted their chance, a jagged outcrop of rock jutting above the ledge. Tahoe, the rocks! We can bring it down! Tahoe understood immediately. He darted past the dogman, drawing its attention, while Etienne scrambled up the outcrop. The dogman snarled and lunged at Tahoe, who dodged nimbly, leading the beast directly beneath the precarious rocks. Etienne heaved with all his strength, dislodging the largest boulder. The stone plummeted, striking the dogman squarely on its back. The beast let out a final, agonized roar before collapsing, its massive body sliding over the edge of the cliff and into the ravine below. Etienne and Tahoe stood in silence, their breaths ragged. The sound of the rushing river far below carried away the tension of the fight. It's gone, Etienne said, though the words felt hollow. For now, Tahoe replied grimly. Neither man moved for several minutes, their bodies too exhausted and their minds too shaken to process the encounter. Finally, they began their descent, their focus on reaching Fort Carleton before nightfall, and before the wilderness could exact its revenge once more. Arrival at Fort Carleton. The sight of Fort Carleton's sturdy wooden palisades rising from the snowy horizon brought a surge of relief to Etienne and Tahoe. The journey had been grueling, marked by relentless cold, harrowing terrain and the shadow of the dogman's terror. Yet here was sanctuary, a beacon of human presence amidst the untamed wilderness. As they approached the gates, Etienne raised a weary hand in greeting. The sentry stationed atop the wall recognized him and called down, "Rousseau, you've made it back!" The heavy gates creaked open, and the warmth of the fort's bustling activity enveloped them. Traders, trappers, and laborers moved about, their faces ruddy from the cold but alive with camaraderie. Etienne felt a pang of longing for normalcy as he and Tahoe stepped inside. The fort commander, a grizzled man named Captain McAllister, greeted them in the main hall. His sharp eyes took in their haggard appearances and the fresh scars that marked Etienne's arm. "You've been through hell, I see," McAllister said, gesturing for them to sit by the roaring hearth. "Tell me everything." Over steaming bowls of stew, Etienne recounted their journey, the wolves, the ancient cliff paintings, and finally, the dogman. Tahoe added his perspective, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. McAllister listened intently, his face grave. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "You're not the first to speak of such a creature," he said. "I've heard whispers from other trappers and the natives, but most dismiss it as legend." Etienne shook his head. "It's no legend, sir. We fought it. We saw its strength, its cunning. It's real." McAllister nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to take precautions. If this dogman roams the mountains, it poses a threat to everyone venturing west." Rest and recovery. The following days brought much-needed rest. Etienne and Tahoe were given quarters, warm blankets, and hearty meals to help them recover. Tahoe, though quiet by nature, became a source of fascination for the fort's residents. His skill in crafting arrows and his knowledge of the land earned him respect, while his calm demeanor made him a welcome presence. Etienne spent time repairing his gear, his hands steady despite the lingering tremor of recent events. Yet, even in the safety of the fort, the memory of the Dogman haunted him. At night, he dreamed of glowing eyes and guttural growls, waking with a start to the comforting hum of the fort's activity, a warning shared. The fort's residents were intrigued by Etienne's tale, and whispers of the Dogman spread quickly. Some dismissed it as superstition, while others looked to the mountains with newfound caution. One evening, Etienne gathered with a small group of trappers around the fire. He shared the journal he had found in the abandoned cabin, its pages worn but its warnings vivid. The men read in silence, their faces shadowed by the flickering flames. "This land has its own rules," one of the older trappers said finally, his voice heavy with experience. "And its own guardians." Tahoe nodded. "The Dogman is no mere animal. It's tied to the spirit of the wilderness, a warning to those who take more than they give." Moving forward, Etienne knew his journey was far from over. Though the fort offered safety, it was a temporary reprieve. The mountains still called to him, their peaks shrouded in mystery and danger. Yet, he would not face them unprepared. With McAllister's support, Etienne began planning his next expedition. He traded stories with other trappers, learning from their experiences, and stocked up on better equipment. Tahoe, now his trusted companion, agreed to join him, their bond forged in the crucible of survival. As Etienne stood on the fort's ramparts, gazing westward, he felt a mixture of trepidation and resolve. The Rockies held both fortune and peril, and the Dogman was only one of its many secrets. But Etienne Rousseau was a trapper, a survivor, and a seeker of the unknown. The wilderness had tested him, but it had not broken him, and as long as there were new trails to blaze, he would answer the call of the Rockies. The grizzly's fury. The new camp sat nestled in a quiet glade, surrounded by towering pines and the steady murmur of a nearby creek. Etienne and Tahoe had chosen the spot for its relative shelter and the abundance of animal tracks in the snow, promising fruitful trapping. The two men worked efficiently to set up camp, pitching a sturdy tent and securing their supplies. The air was crisp and cold, with the fading sun casting long shadows across the forest. As they prepared their evening meal over a crackling fire, the tension of the Dogman encounter began to ease. The stillness of the woods offered a deceptive sense of calm. That calm was shattered by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down their spines. Tahoe froze, his hand halfway to his knife. Etienne turned toward the sound, his heart thudding as he caught sight of movement in the trees. A massive grizzly bear lumbered into view, its bulk immense and its eyes locked on the camp. Its fur was a patchwork of scars, and its breath steamed in the icy air. This was no curious animal. It was a predator asserting dominance over its territory. "Don't move," Tahoe whispered, his voice barely audible. He slowly reached for his bow. Etienne's hand tightened on his musket, his pulse racing. The bear growled again, louder this time, stepping closer. The firelight danced on its shaggy fur, illuminating the sheer power of the creature. "Slowly back away," Tahoe instructed, his voice steady despite the danger. "Do not run." They began to retreat, step by agonizing step, but the bear had already decided to assert its dominance. With a deafening roar, it charged. The fight for survival. Etienne raised his musket, aiming for the charging beast. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the glade, the ball striking the bear's shoulder. It let out a furious roar, but did not stop. The musket fell from Etienne's hands as he scrambled for his hunting knife. Tahoe loosed an arrow, the shaft sinking deep into the grizzly's flank. The bear snarled in pain, swinging its massive paw and sending a nearby log flying. Its sheer ferocity was overwhelming, a primal force of nature intent on destruction. The bear lunged at Etienne, who dived to the side just in time, the claws raking through the air where he had stood. Tahoe shouted, drawing the beast's attention. Another arrow flew, this time striking the bear's neck. The grizzly turned, charging at Tahoe with terrifying speed. Tahoe darted behind a tree, the bear slamming into the trunk with a force that shook the ground. Splinters flew as the massive animal reared up on its hind legs, towering over both men. Etienne, seizing the moment, grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the bear. The flames licked at its fur, and the beast roared in fury, swiping at the glowing ember. The distraction bought them a few precious seconds. "To the creek!" Tahoe yelled, grabbing Etienne's arm. They sprinted toward the sound of rushing water, the bear thundering after them. Branches snapped and snow sprayed as they ran, adrenaline fueling their desperate escape. Reaching the creek, Tahoe and Etienne turned to face the beast. The bear barreled out of the trees, its eyes wild with rage. Etienne grabbed a large rock from the creek bed, gripping it tightly as Tahoe knocked another arrow. The grizzly hesitated for a moment, sniffing the air. Blood dripped from its wounds, but its strength remained undiminished. It charged again, and Tahoe loosed his arrow. The shaft struck true, piercing the bear's chest. Etienne hurled the rock with all his strength, striking the bear's head. The impact stunned it, causing it to falter. Tahoe seized the opportunity, plunging his knife into the creature's side. The grizzly let out a final, ear-splitting roar before collapsing into the snow. Its massive body heaved once, then lay still. The silence that followed was deafening. Etienne and Tahoe stood motionless, their breaths ragged, staring at the fallen beast. Blood stained the snow, and the acrid smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Tahoe knelt by the bear, murmuring a prayer of respect for the animal's spirit. Etienne, his hands trembling, retrieved his musket and began reloading it, his mind racing. "That was no ordinary bear," Tahoe said finally, his voice heavy. "It had survived many battles. It was a guardian of this place." Etienne nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The fight had left him drained, but also profoundly aware of the fragile balance of life in the wilderness. The two men worked in silence to salvage what they could from the bear. Its pelt and meat would sustain them, but the memory of the encounter would haunt their nights for many winters to come. The days following the grizzly bear attack brought a sense of uneasy quiet to the camp. Etienne and Tahoe resumed their routine of checking traps and preparing furs, but the wilderness seemed heavier, as if the land itself were watching. Etienne, however, welcomed the monotony. It was a reprieve from the harrowing encounters of the past weeks. One crisp afternoon, as Etienne was fleshing a beaver hide, the sound of voices echoed through the trees. Tahoe straightened from where he was stacking firewood, his expression softening into a rare smile. "It's my family," he said simply, brushing the wood dust from his hands and heading toward the source of the sound. Etienne followed, curious but cautious. Soon a small group emerged from the forest. An older man and woman with weathered faces, a younger boy carrying a bundle of supplies, and a young woman who walked with quiet confidence. Tahoe greeted them warmly, clasping the older man's hand and embracing the woman. They spoke in their native tongue, their words flowing like a familiar melody. The boy grinned up at Tahoe, who ruffled his hair. Then Tahoe turned to Etienne. "This is my family," he said, switching to French. "My father, Nahan, my mother, Winona, my brother, Coda, and this," he gestured to the young woman, "is my sister, Aita." Etienne offered a polite nod to each in turn, but his gaze lingered on Aita. She was striking, with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the forest and long, raven-black hair braided neatly over her shoulder. Her posture was poised, her expression calm but curious as she studied the Frenchman. "You are the trapper my brother speaks of?" Aita asked in French, her accent lilting. "I am," Etienne replied, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious. "Etienne Rousseau, at your service." Aita inclined her head. "Tahoe says you are brave, but also that you find trouble easily." Her words were delivered with a faint smile that suggested she was teasing. Etienne chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. Trouble seems to find me, I'm afraid. Tahoe's family stayed in the camp for several days, bringing much-needed supplies and a sense of warmth. Nahan and Tahoe repaired tools and shared stories around the fire. Winona and Aita prepared meals, their skillful hands turning the camp provisions into something that felt like home. Etienne found himself drawn to Aita, though he tried to mask it. She moved with an ease that reminded him of the wind through the trees, her quiet strength complementing Tahoe's resolute demeanor. At first, their interactions were polite and sparse, but as the days passed, Aita began to engage him more, asking about his life and his journey. One evening, as the others slept, Etienne sat by the fire, gazing into the flickering flames. Aita joined him, her steps so light he hadn't noticed her approach. She sat on a log across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You've traveled far," she said, breaking the silence. "I have," Etienne replied, meeting her gaze. "Farther than I ever imagined when I left France." "Do you miss it? Your home?" Etienne hesitated, the question stirring a pang of longing. "At times, but the wilderness has a way of becoming home too, even with all its dangers." Aita nodded. "My people say the land is alive, that it watches and tests those who walk it. Perhaps it sees something in you." Her words carried a depth that left Etienne momentarily speechless. He glanced at her, noticing the firelight dancing in her eyes. "If the land tests us, it's only because it wants us to respect it," he said finally. Aita smiled faintly, then rose. "Good night, Etienne." "Good night," he replied, watching her retreat to her tent. Over the following days, Etienne found himself seeking Aita's company whenever he could, whether it was helping her carry water or asking her opinion on the best way to mend a torn trap. Their conversations grew more comfortable, filled with quiet humor and shared observations about the wilderness. Tahoe noticed, of course. One afternoon, as they were setting traps by the creek, he smirked at Etienne. "You watch her too much," Tahoe said bluntly, startling Etienne. "What?" Etienne stammered, his face reddening. "My sister," Tahoe clarified, setting a trap with practiced ease. "You think I don't see the way you look at her?" Etienne hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally he said, "She's remarkable." Tahoe's smirk faded into a more serious expression. "She is strong like the roots of the oldest tree, but she has seen pain too. If you care for her, you must respect that." Etienne nodded, humbled by Tahoe's words. "I understand." Tahoe clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Now let's finish these traps before the sun sets." On their last evening together, as Tahoe's family prepared to leave the next day, Etienne found Aita standing at the edge of the camp, gazing at the setting sun. The sky was painted in hues of gold and crimson, the mountains casting long shadows. He approached her cautiously. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Aita glanced at him and nodded. "It reminds me that everything changes. The day ends, but the sun will rise again." Etienne studied her profile, the way her hair caught the light. "Change isn't always bad," he said. She turned to him, a curious expression on her face. "No, it isn't." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally Aita said, "Be careful, Etienne. The wilderness is kind to those who respect it, but it is unforgiving to those who are careless." "I will be," Etienne promised. Aita nodded, then stepped closer, placing a hand briefly on his arm. "Thank you for watching over my brother." Before he could respond, she walked away, leaving Etienne standing alone under the vast, star-speckled sky. The Valley of Whispers. With Tahoe's family departed, Etienne and Tahoe resumed their journey, their packs heavier with supplies and their hearts lighter from the brief taste of companionship and familiarity. But as the wilderness reclaimed them, the mountains seemed to close in, their silence pressing like a weight on their shoulders. The two men pushed deeper into the Rockies, following trails that grew narrower and more perilous. Days passed in grueling rhythm, hiking through dense forest, crossing frigid streams, and climbing treacherous ridges. Etienne's muscles burned and his boots were worn thin, but the promise of the valley they'd heard about from other trappers kept them going. "Some call it the Valley of Whispers," Tahoe said one evening as they set up camp under a canopy of pine trees. Etienne glanced up from where he was coaxing a fire to life. "Why that name?" Tahoe shrugged, his expression pensive. "They say the wind carries voices there. Some claim they're spirits, others say it's just the mountains playing tricks. But all agree, the valley is rich with game." Etienne nodded, though unease prickled at the back of his mind. The wilderness had already shown him how thin the line between myth and reality could be. By the third day, they reached the entrance to the valley. The terrain shifted dramatically. What had been rugged and steep softened into rolling hills blanketed with thick grass. A river meandered lazily through the landscape, its surface reflecting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded it. Etienne paused at the crest of a hill, taking in the view. "It's beautiful," he admitted, though his voice was wary. "It is," Tahoe agreed, but his eyes scanned the distant tree line with suspicion. Too quiet. They descended into the valley cautiously, keeping their weapons close at hand. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. At first, the valley seemed a hunter's paradise. Tracks of elk and deer crisscrossed the ground, and beaver dams dotted the riverbanks. They quickly set up camp near a small grove, eager to begin trapping at dawn. Yet, as night fell, the valley's stillness became oppressive. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint, eerie sounds that neither man could quite place. Etienne lay awake in his bedroll, staring at the stars as unease coiled in his gut. "What do you make of it?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. Tahoe, who was sharpening his knife by the fire, paused. "The land feels watchful," he said, "like it's waiting." Etienne didn't reply. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what it was waiting for. By the third day, they reached the entrance to the valley. The terrain shifted dramatically. What had been rugged and steep softened into rolling hills blanketed with thick grass. A river meandered lazily through the landscape, its surface reflecting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded it. Etienne paused at the crest of a hill, taking in the view. "It's beautiful," he admitted, though his voice was wary. "It is." Tahoe agreed, but his eyes scanned the distant tree line with suspicion. Too quiet. They descended into the valley cautiously, keeping their weapons close at hand. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. At first, the valley seemed a hunter's paradise. Tracks of elk and deer crisscrossed the ground, and beaver dams dotted the riverbanks. They quickly set up camp near a small grove, eager to begin trapping at dawn. Yet, as night fell, the valley's stillness became oppressive. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint, eerie sounds that neither man could quite place. Etienne lay awake in his bedroll, staring at the stars as unease coiled in his gut. "What do you make of it?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. Tahoe, who was sharpening his knife by the fire, paused. "The land feels watchful," he said, "like it's waiting." Etienne didn't reply. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what it was waiting for. The next day, while scouting the valley's western edge, they stumbled upon an abandoned camp. The remnants of a lean-to sagged under the weight of neglect, and scattered belongings lay strewn about. A torn bedroll, a rusted cooking pot, and a broken musket. Tahoe crouched by the fire pit, examining the cold ashes. "This hasn't been used in weeks," he murmured. Etienne picked up a scrap of cloth, its edges frayed and stained dark. "There was a struggle," he said grimly, noting claw marks gouged into a nearby tree trunk. They exchanged a glance, each man silently reaching the same conclusion. Something or someone had driven the camp's occupants away. "We should move carefully," Tahoe said, rising to his feet. Etienne nodded, his grip tightening on his musket. The first signs that evening, as they prepared to check their traps, the whispers began. At first, Etienne thought it was the wind, but as he and Tahoe walked along the riverbank, the sound grew clearer, low, indistinct voices murmuring just out of reach. "Do you hear that?" Etienne asked, his voice low. Tahoe nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. "It's coming from the trees." They stopped, listening intently. The voices faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves. But the feeling of being watched remained, pressing down on them like a tangible weight. When they returned to camp, they found their supplies disturbed. A sack of flour had been ripped open, its contents scattered across the ground, and one of their traps was missing. "Bears?" Etienne suggested, though he didn't believe it. Tahoe shook his head. No tracks. The men reinforced their camp, setting up crude alarms using tripwires and metal pans. Whatever was in the valley, it was no ordinary predator. That night, Etienne woke to the sound of something moving just beyond the firelight. He sat up, musket in hand, straining to see through the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. "Tahoe," he whispered, nudging his companion awake. Tahoe was instantly alert, grabbing his bow. "What is it?" Before Etienne could answer, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the forest. Both men froze, their eyes locked on the darkness. From the shadows emerged a figure that sent a chill through Etienne's blood. It was massive, walking on two legs but hunched as if burdened by its own weight. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its breath steamed in the cold night air. The Dogman. Etienne and Tahoe scrambled to their feet, weapons raised. The creature stepped closer, its movements unnervingly deliberate. It let out a snarl, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Stay together," Tahoe said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. Etienne aimed his musket, but before he could fire, the Dogman lunged with incredible speed. The two men dove in opposite directions, the creature's claws raking the air where they had stood moments before. Tahoe shot an arrow, striking the beast in its shoulder. It roared in fury, turning its attention to him. Etienne seized the moment to reload, his hands shaking as he poured powder into the barrel. The Dogman swiped at Tahoe, who dodged and slashed at its flank with his knife. The blade left a shallow gash, but the creature barely seemed to notice. Etienne fired his musket, the shot striking the Dogman square in the chest. It staggered, letting out a pained howl, but instead of falling, it retreated into the shadows, its glowing eyes lingering for a moment before disappearing entirely. Breathing heavily, the two men stood in silence, their ears straining for any sign of the creature's return. "We need to leave," Tahoe said finally, his voice grim. Etienne nodded. The Valley of Whispers had lived up to its name, and its dangers were far greater than they had imagined. Traversing to the next valley. At dawn, Etienne and Tahoe packed their belongings with haste, their movements quiet and efficient. The lingering sense of danger from the night before hung over them like a dark cloud. Neither man spoke much, but the tension in their shared glances spoke volumes. The Valley of Whispers had proven more treacherous than they could have anticipated, and staying there was no longer an option. By mid-morning, they were on the move, following the river out of the valley. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the crunch of their boots on frost-bitten grass and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Etienne couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you think it's following us?" Etienne asked, his voice low. Tahoe glanced over his shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain. "If it wanted to attack again, it wouldn't wait. It's toying with us, I think." The thought sent a shiver down Etienne's spine. He tightened his grip on his musket, his thumb brushing the cold steel barrel as they pressed onward. The route to the next valley was far from straightforward. The trail climbed steeply, winding through narrow ridges and dense thickets of pine. At one point, they were forced to scale a rocky outcrop, their packs weighing them down as they scrambled over jagged stone. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became, making every step a struggle. Etienne paused to catch his breath, glancing back at the valley below. It looked peaceful from this height, its river glinting in the sunlight like a silver ribbon. But the beauty was deceptive. He knew what lurked within its shadows. "Not much farther," Tahoe said, pointing to a ridgeline ahead. Beyond it lay the next valley, one the other trappers had described as fertile and abundant with game. They reached the summit by late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape. Etienne stopped to take in the view. The new valley stretched before them, its golden meadows and dark forests framed by towering peaks. A herd of elk grazed in the distance, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. "It looks promising," Etienne said, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. Tahoe nodded but remained wary. "We'll set camp near the tree line, close enough to the river but not exposed." As night fell, they found a sheltered spot at the base of a rocky bluff, surrounded by pines that offered some protection from the wind. They built a modest fire and prepared a simple meal of dried meat and boiled roots and bannock. For the first time in days, the evening passed uneventfully. There were no strange howls, no eerie whispers carried on the wind. Etienne began to relax, though his musket remained within arm's reach as he stretched out by the fire. "This place feels different," he said, glancing at Tahoe. "Safer, maybe." Tahoe poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a spray of sparks. "Don't let your guard down. We don't know what's out there yet." Etienne nodded, knowing Tahoe's caution was well-founded. The wilderness had a way of lulling travelers into a false sense of security before striking. The first signs the next morning, they began setting traps along the riverbank, taking advantage of the abundant animal tracks that crisscrossed the area. The work was meticulous, requiring patience and precision. Etienne felt a sense of satisfaction as they finished each set, imagining the pelts they would bring back to Fort Carlton. But as they moved deeper into the valley, strange signs began to appear. A grove of trees bore deep claw marks, the bark shredded and oozing sap. Nearby, a deer carcass lay half buried in leaves, its body torn apart as if by an enormous predator. "This isn't the work of a bear," Tahoe said, crouching beside the remains. Etienne felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Do you think it's the Dogman?" Tahoe didn't answer immediately. He stood and surveyed their surroundings, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's big, and it's hunting here." That evening, their campfire burned brighter and hotter than usual, a defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness. Tahoe crafted additional arrows, sharpening their tips with methodical precision, while Etienne cleaned and reloaded his musket. The sounds of the night were unsettling. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint, distant noises that set Etienne's nerves on edge. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest, and both men froze, their eyes darting to the shadows. "It's testing us," Tahoe said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Etienne swallowed hard, his hand resting on the stock of his musket. He felt the weight of the wilderness pressing down on them, an oppressive force that made even the stars seem dimmer. They sat in silence for hours, their senses heightened, waiting for a threat that might never come, or might already be upon them. As dawn broke, Etienne and Tahoe packed their gear and ventured further into the valley, determined to uncover its secrets. The tension between them was palpable, their movements cautious as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain. Though the valley seemed idyllic on the surface, it was clear that something lurked beneath its serene exterior. As they worked to expand their trap lines, both men couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The new valley promised opportunity, but it also held dangers they had yet to fully understand. Whatever awaited them in this untamed wilderness, they knew one thing for certain: survival would demand every ounce of their skill, courage, and resolve. Etienne and Tahoe stood at the edge of their makeshift camp, surveying the valley with a critical eye. The new location offered promise: fertile trapping grounds, a river teeming with fish, and a sense of uneasy peace. But both men understood the importance of protection. If they were to remain here for the winter season, a sturdy cabin was essential. "We can't rely on the fire alone to keep predators away," Tahoe said, his voice steady but firm. "A cabin will give us shelter, and walls will mean the difference between life and death if anything decides to test our strength." Etienne nodded, already envisioning the structure in his mind. "We'll need logs, sturdy ones, and time. This valley isn't going to make it easy for us." Without hesitation, the two men began their work. The first step was selecting a site for the cabin. They chose a flat piece of land near the tree line, close enough to the river for water, but far enough to avoid flooding. The location also offered a clear view of the surrounding terrain, allowing them to spot potential dangers. Using their axes, Etienne and Tahoe felled tall, straight pine trees. Each swing of the axe echoed through the forest, a rhythmic sound that became part of their routine. The work was grueling, the cold air biting at their exposed skin, but they pressed on, driven by necessity. Once the trees were down, they stripped the bark and cut the logs to size. Etienne's arms burned from the effort, and sweat soaked his shirt despite the chill. Tahoe worked beside him, his movements efficient and practiced. With the logs prepared, they began constructing the cabin. Etienne sketched out a rough plan in the dirt: a single-room structure with a small fireplace and reinforced door. Together, they notched the logs and stacked them in a sturdy frame, their craftsmanship honed by years of survival in the wilderness. The walls grew steadily higher, each log fitted carefully to prevent gaps that could let in the biting wind, or worse, something that prowled in the night. They left a space for a single window, covering it temporarily with thick hides until they could fashion proper shutters. The fireplace was their next priority. Using flat stones collected from the riverbank, they built a hearth at the center of the cabin. Etienne took care to arrange the stones tightly, ensuring the smoke would funnel properly through the chimney and not into their living space. The roof was a challenge. They fashioned it from overlapping logs and covered it with branches and mud to keep out rain and snow. The process took days, their progress slowed by fatigue and the constant need to remain vigilant against the wilderness. At night, the half-built cabin offered little protection. They slept in shifts, one keeping watch while the other rested. Strange sounds punctuated the darkness: a rustling in the underbrush, a distant howl that might have been a wolf but carried an eerie guttural tone. On the third night, Etienne woke to Tahoe shaking his shoulder. "Something's out there," Tahoe whispered, gesturing toward the tree line. Etienne grabbed his musket, his pulse quickening. The firelight illuminated a pair of glowing eyes just beyond the edge of the camp. The creature didn't approach but lingered, its outline barely visible. Tahoe raised his bow, his arrow nocked and ready. "Don't shoot unless it charges," Etienne murmured, his voice barely audible. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity before the creature slunk back into the forest, its presence leaving both men rattled but unharmed. By the end of the week, the cabin was finally complete. Its sturdy walls and reinforced door gave them a sense of security they hadn't felt since arriving in the valley. Inside, they arranged their supplies neatly, placing traps, tools, and provisions within easy reach. Tahoe inspected the door one last time, testing the wooden bar they'd fashioned to secure it. "It'll hold," he said, his tone confident. Etienne sat by the fire, his musket resting against the wall. "We're safer now," he agreed, "but we can't get complacent. This valley has its secrets, and I don't think we've seen the last of them." The cabin became their sanctuary, a stronghold against the wilderness. Yet, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, both men knew the fight for survival was far from over. The return of spring in Aida. As the snow began to melt and the valley stirred with the first signs of spring, a renewed sense of hope settled over Etienne and Tahoe. The frozen river started to flow again. The forest came alive with the songs of birds, and the oppressive cold gave way to the fresh, crisp air of the season. The change was a welcome reprieve from the tense, silent months they had endured. For Etienne, it was a chance to breathe more freely, to remind himself that there was life beyond the shadow of the Dogman. For Tahoe, it meant preparing the land and their supplies for the warmer months ahead. One bright morning, as the sun climbed higher in the sky than it had in months, a familiar figure appeared on the distant trail leading into the valley. Tahoe was the first to notice, his keen eyes narrowing before a wide smile spread across his face. "Aida," he said, his voice filled with joy. Etienne's heart quickened. Aida, Tahoe's sister, had returned. Aida arrived with a pack laden with supplies and gifts, her steps light and confident. Her dark hair was braided neatly, and her smile lit up her face as she embraced her brother. "I told you I'd return," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of the season. Tahoe laughed, motioning toward Etienne. "And he survived the winter no less." Aida turned her gaze to Etienne, her smile softening. "It's good to see you again, Etienne." Etienne felt his cheeks flush, and he stumbled over his words. It's good to see you too. The valley feels brighter already." Aida laughed, a sound like a bubbling stream, and Etienne's awkwardness seemed to amuse her. Aida's arrival brought new energy to the camp. She busied herself helping with repairs to the cabin, cooking hearty meals over the fire, and sharing stories from her travels. Her presence seemed to fill the space with life, easing the tension that had lingered since winter. For Etienne, her return was both a comfort and a challenge. He found himself drawn to her warmth and confidence, yet hesitant to act on his growing admiration. Tahoe, ever perceptive, noticed his friend's glances and raised a knowing eyebrow but said nothing. Aida, for her part, seemed to enjoy Etienne's company. She would laugh at his jokes, ask him about his life in France, and often invite him to join her on walks around the valley. Etienne found himself looking forward to these moments, cherishing the way her presence softened the edges of his rough, solitary life. Despite the joy of Aida's return, the shadow of the Dogman had not completely lifted. While it had remained unseen since the thaw, the memory of its presence loomed over Etienne and Tahoe. Aida listened intently as they recounted their encounters, her expression growing serious. "My father spoke of such a creature," she said one evening by the fire. "He said it walks between two worlds, man and beast. It is neither friend nor foe, but a guardian of the wild places." "Guardian or not," Etienne said, his voice low, "it's a danger." Aida shook her head. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it watches because it wonders about us as much as we wonder about it." Her words left Etienne thoughtful, though they did little to ease his vigilance. With spring came fresh challenges and opportunities. The trio worked together to expand their trap lines, repair their equipment, and explore the valley further. Aida's insights into the land proved invaluable, and her cheerful determination inspired both men. For Etienne, each day brought a new appreciation for Aida's resilience and spirit. He found himself longing for her laughter, seeking her out in quiet moments and marveling at her strength. The harsh isolation of the winter now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of her presence. As the valley blossomed around them, so too did Etienne's hope. The wilderness was still wild, the shadows still deep, but the promise of spring and the promise of Aida offered a light that even the darkest corners could not extinguish. Summer of love. The valley was in full bloom as summer arrived, painting the wilderness with vibrant greens and bursts of wildflowers. Birds sang in the trees, and the rivers, now free of ice, shimmered under the sun. Etienne and Aida spent more time together as the days grew longer, their bond deepening with each passing week. They wandered through the meadows, gathering herbs and laughing at Etienne's attempts to name the plants in Tahoe's language. They fished in the cool streams, Aita effortlessly outmatching Etienne, much to his mock chagrin. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, their conversations ranging from dreams of the future to stories of their pasts. For Etienne, the wilderness was no longer just a place of survival. It was a home, a sanctuary where he had found something or someone worth staying for. Aita, with her wisdom and warmth, had become the center of his world. Tahoe, ever the observant brother, watched their growing affection with a mixture of amusement and approval. One evening, as Etienne nervously sought his blessing, Tahoe clapped him on the back with a grin. "Treat her well," Tahoe said, his tone both teasing and serious, "or you'll answer to me." Etienne nodded solemnly. "I promise." One clear summer night, under a sky bursting with stars, Etienne led Aita to a hill overlooking the valley. Fireflies danced in the tall grass, and the air was filled with the soft hum of crickets. Etienne's heart raced as he took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers trembling slightly. "Aita," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "when I came to this land, I thought I was seeking fortune, but instead I found something far more precious. You've shown me what it means to truly live, to love. I don't want to face another winter or another day without you by my side." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring he had fashioned from silver wire, polished until it gleamed. "Will you marry me?" Aita's eyes filled with tears as she smiled, her voice soft but certain. "Yes, Etienne, I will." As the leaves turned to fiery hues of red and gold, the valley seemed to glow with warmth and life. Aita and Etienne decided to marry before the first snow, their union a celebration of love, survival, and the beauty of the wilderness. Tahoe took charge of the preparations, enlisting the help of nearby trappers and native families. The wedding was held in a meadow, the towering peaks of the Rockies standing as witnesses to their vows. Aita wore a dress adorned with beads and feathers, a gift from her family. Etienne, dressed in his best furs, looked every bit the rugged mountain man he had become. They exchanged vows in both French and Aita's native tongue, a blending of their worlds that spoke to the strength of their bond. The celebration lasted well into the night, with laughter, dancing, and the sharing of stories. Etienne marveled at the sense of community that had grown around them, a stark contrast to the lonely days he had once known. As the fire crackled and the stars shone brightly above, Etienne and Aita stood together, their hands intertwined. The wilderness still held its challenges, its dangers, and its mysteries, but they faced it with the strength of their love and the support of those around them. In the heart of the Rockies, they had found not only survival, but also a life filled with hope, joy, and endless possibilities. And as the first chill of winter crept into the air, Etienne knew they would face it together, ready for whatever lay ahead. The return of the Dogman. As the snows melted and the rivers swelled with spring runoff, the valley awoke from its long winter slumber. Etienne and Aita, now seasoned in the rhythms of wilderness life, spent their days tending to their traps, repairing the cabin, and reveling in their new life together. Tahoe often joined them, his laughter filling the crisp air as they worked side by side. But with spring's arrival came an unsettling change. Strange signs began to appear on the edges of their territory. Etienne noticed deep claw marks etched into tree trunks near the outer traps, marks too large and deliberate to be made by any known predator. Aita found tracks in the damp earth near the riverbank, massive, canine-like prints that seemed to follow no logical path. The nights grew uneasy. The familiar sounds of the wilderness, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by distant howls that sent chills down their spines. The howls were unlike those of wolves, deeper, more guttural, and filled with an unplaceable malice. One evening, as the couple sat by the fire inside their cabin, Tahoe burst in, his face pale and his bow clutched tightly in his hand. "It's back," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The Dogman." The following days were filled with tension as they fortified the cabin and laid traps around its perimeter. Tahoe patrolled the area with a relentless vigilance, his arrows tipped with poison he had prepared using local herbs. Etienne crafted spears and reinforced their musket supplies, his mind racing with plans for defense. Aida, ever resourceful, created charms from feathers and beads, offerings of protection to the spirits of the land. Despite their efforts, the Dogman's presence loomed. It didn't attack, but made itself known, its glowing eyes watching from the tree line at dusk, its shadow flickering in the firelight like a specter. Etienne woke one morning to find the cabin surrounded by tracks, circling closer with each pass. "We can't ignore it," Aida said one evening, her tone resolute. "If it wants us gone, it won't stop until we confront it." Etienne nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll face it together." The sun hung low on the horizon as Etienne and Tahoe trudged back to the cabin, their packs weighed down with traps and supplies. The day had been productive but exhausting, and both men looked forward to the warmth of a fire and Aita's laughter to chase away the chill of the evening. As they approached, something felt wrong. The air was too still, the usual sounds of the forest muted. The clearing around the cabin bore no signs of Aita tending to chores or preparing dinner. Instead, the door hung ajar, its hinges creaking faintly in the breeze. "Something's not right," Etienne muttered, his hand tightening around his musket. Tahoe drew his bow, nodding silently. They moved cautiously, their boots crunching on the dirt path. The cabin was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, supplies scattered, and the fire pit was cold. A faint, coppery scent hung in the air, setting Etienne's heart racing. "Aita?" Etienne called, his voice trembling. There was no reply. Tahoe knelt by the doorway, examining the ground. "Tracks," he said, pointing to deep impressions in the soil. "Large, the Dogman." Etienne's stomach dropped as his eyes followed the tracks leading away from the cabin and into the forest. His heart screamed for him to rush after them, but Tahoe placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Wait, we need to be smart. If it's taken her—" Tahoe's words trailed off, unspoken fears hanging heavy between them. The two men followed the tracks into the forest, their weapons at the ready. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in an eerie twilight. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. "Aita!" Etienne called again, desperation cracking his voice. A low growl answered from somewhere ahead, freezing both men in their tracks. Tahoe gestured for silence, his eyes scanning the underbrush. They pressed on, the tracks leading them deeper into the wilderness. Etienne's mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. He gripped his musket so tightly his knuckles turned white. At last, they reached a small clearing where the tracks ended. The sight that met them stole the breath from Etienne's lungs. Aida lay motionless in the grass, her body marked with deep claw wounds. Her dark hair fanned around her pale face, her lifeless eyes staring at the stars. "No." Etienne fell to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her. The warmth of her skin was gone, replaced by the cold stillness of death. Tahoe stood behind him, his bow at the ready, scanning the shadows. "It's close," he said grimly. Etienne's grief transformed into a burning rage. He clenched his fists, his body shaking with fury. "This ends tonight," he growled, rising to his feet. The confrontation. A rustling in the bushes signaled the Dogman's arrival. It stepped into the clearing, its massive form illuminated by the moonlight. Blood matted its fur, and its glowing eyes burned with a savage hunger. Etienne raised his musket, his aim steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "You took her from me," he said, through gritted teeth. "You'll pay for this." The Dogman let out a guttural snarl and lunged. Etienne fired, the shot striking the creature in the chest. It stumbled, but didn't fall, its rage propelling it forward. Etienne grabbed a spear from his pack and charged, driving the weapon into the creature's side. The dogman howled, its claws raking across Etienne's arm, drawing blood. Tahoe circled the beast, firing arrow after arrow with precision. The dogman turned its attention to him, lunging with terrifying speed. Tahoe dodged, rolling to the side and slashing at the beast with his knife. The battle raged on, each man fighting with a ferocity born of grief and desperation. Finally, Etienne found an opening. He drove his blade deep into the dogman's chest, twisting it with all his strength. The creature let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing to the ground. Its glowing eyes dimmed and its massive body fell still. The forest fell silent, the only sounds their ragged breaths and the crackle of leaves beneath their boots. Etienne sank to his knees beside Aida's body, his hands trembling as he cradled her. "She didn't deserve this," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tahoe placed a hand on his shoulder, his own face etched with sorrow. "She was strong, Etienne. She would want us to survive." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they began the somber task of burying Aida beneath a tall pine tree near the cabin. Etienne carved her name into the bark, a small tribute to the woman who had brought love and light into his life. Though the dogman was gone, its shadow lingered over the valley. Etienne and Tahoe vowed to protect the land Aida had called home, knowing her spirit would always be with them. The golden hues of fall crept into the valley, painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson. The air carried a crispness that signaled the coming of winter, a season Etienne and Tahoe both dreaded and welcomed. Days stretched into weeks since Aida's death, and the wounds in their hearts were raw, though their determination to endure grew stronger with each passing day. Etienne found solace in the monotony of preparation. He repaired traps with meticulous care, sharpening blades and reinforcing springs. The simple, repetitive tasks allowed him to push away the weight of his loss, if only for a time. Tahoe, too, buried his grief in action, ensuring their stores of food and firewood were ample to survive the harsh months ahead. The cabin, though quiet now, became a place of remembrance and resilience. Aida's absence was a constant, haunting presence, but her spirit seemed to linger in the warmth of the fire and the way the wind whispered through the trees. Etienne often found himself sitting by the carved pine where she rested, speaking softly as though she could hear him. As the first frost blanketed the ground, Etienne and Tahoe set out to prepare their trap lines. They chose a new route this season, venturing deeper into the valley to a place they had only heard about from other trappers. The rumors spoke of abundant game, but warned of treacherous terrain and an unforgiving winter. For Etienne, the challenge was more than a necessity. It was a way to keep his mind from dwelling on the past. The days were long and grueling. They trudged through dense forests, marking trails and setting traps in the hopes of a bountiful season. Each morning they checked their lines, hauling in beaver, fox, and ermine. The rhythm of work was steady, its demands leaving little room for idle thought. Etienne often found himself lost in the wilderness, not in fear, but in focus. The land, despite its hardships, offered a quiet kind of healing. The sharp cries of hawks overhead and the rustle of leaves underfoot reminded him that life persisted, even in the face of loss. Tahoe, too, seemed to find peace in the land. Though his grief was evident in his somber demeanor, he took on the role of protector, watching over Etienne as they ventured deeper into the wild. Their bond strengthened in those weeks, forged by shared loss and the unyielding will to survive. By mid-fall, the cabin was stocked with furs and provisions. The work had been fruitful, but Etienne knew the true test lay ahead. Winter in the Rockies was merciless, and survival required vigilance and preparation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Tahoe broke the silence. "Aida would want us to keep going. he said, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. Etienne nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. She was always stronger than me, he admitted. She'd find a way to make even this valley feel like home. Tahoe managed a faint smile. Then we owe it to her to try. The two men raised a silent toast with tin cups of weak whiskey, their unspoken promise binding them. As fall gave way to winter, the valley transformed. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling the world in a quiet stillness. The days grew shorter and the nights were long and cold. Yet Etienne and Tahoe pressed on, their resolve unshaken. Each trap they checked, each fur they skinned, was a small victory in the battle against despair. The wilderness, harsh as it was, became a canvas for their resilience. And though the shadow of Aida's death lingered, they found strength in honoring her memory through their perseverance. As the first true storm of the season rolled in, Etienne stood outside the cabin, watching the snow fall. He thought of Aita, her laughter, her warmth, and her strength. The mountains had taken much from him, but they had also given him something he could not yet name, a deeper understanding of life, loss, and the unyielding force of nature. When Tahoe joined him, the two stood in silence, their breath visible in the frosty air. The wilderness stretched before them, vast and unrelenting, but they were ready. Together, they would face the winter, carrying Aida's spirit with them as they fought for survival and a new sense of purpose. The return of the howl. As the snow began to melt and the rivers roared back to life, Etienne and Tahoe welcomed the arrival of spring with a bittersweet sense of renewal. The harsh winter had tested them in every way, but they had survived. Furs were bundled and ready for trade, the cabin repaired after months of brutal weather. Yet, with the thaw came a haunting reminder of the wilderness's darker side, a new howl that echoed through the valley, distinct and bone-chilling. The first time they heard it was on a moonlit night, as the two sat by a modest fire outside the cabin. The woods, usually lively in spring, were unusually quiet. Then it came, a low guttural sound that rose into a mournful wail. Etienne froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "That's not a wolf," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Tahoe, sharpening his blade, paused mid-stroke. His dark eyes narrowed as he stared into the shadows. "No, it's something else," he said gravely, setting his knife down and reaching for his bow. The howl came again, closer this time, resonating with a primal menace that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath them. Both men stood, weapons in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The following days brought no sign of the creature, but the eerie howls persisted. Each night the calls grew nearer, echoing through the valley like a phantom's lament. It wasn't long before the signs began to appear. Tracks too large for any wolf, claw marks gouged deep into trees, and traps left mangled and empty. Tahoe's usually calm demeanor grew tense, and Etienne found himself checking the musket more frequently, ensuring it was always loaded and within reach. The air carried a weight, as though the valley itself was holding its breath. One morning they discovered a kill not far from the cabin. A deer torn apart with a ferocity that left no doubt about the predator's strength. The carcass was left uneaten, as if the attack had been driven by rage rather than hunger. "This isn't just a beast," Tahoe said as he studied the remains. "It's a warning." Etienne nodded, his jaw tightening. He had read about territorial predators before, but this felt different. This felt personal. As the days lengthened, so did the boldness of the creature. One night, Etienne woke to the sound of heavy breathing just outside the cabin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. He grabbed his musket and crept to the window, peering out cautiously. In the pale moonlight, he saw it, a hulking figure with a lupine head, its glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. Its fur bristled as it sniffed the air. The movement slow and deliberate. Etienne's breath caught in his throat. He could hear its claws scraping against the earth as it prowled closer. Tahoe stirred, instinctively reaching for his bow. "It's here, isn't it?" he whispered. Etienne nodded, motioning for silence. They stayed frozen, listening as the creature circled the cabin. The floorboards creaked beneath them as they shifted their weight, and the beast let out a guttural growl. The next few moments passed in agonizing tension. Etienne tightened his grip on the musket, ready to fire if the beast breached the door. But instead, it stopped, its head tilting as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, with a final growl, it retreated into the woods, its heavy footsteps fading into the night. By dawn, both men knew they couldn't let this continue. The Dogman, or whatever it was testing them, asserting its dominance over the valley. "We can't run," Tahoe said, his voice firm. "If we leave, it'll only follow. We have to face it." Etienne hesitated, his mind racing through the stories he had heard and the journal he had found in the abandoned cabin. "If we fight it, we have to be smart. It's stronger, faster, but it's not invincible." Together they devised a plan. They would lure the creature into a clearing near the river, where they would have the advantage of open ground. Etienne prepared his musket with extra powder and shot, while Tahoe crafted a series of crude but sharp-tipped stakes to drive into the earth. The stage was set, but the question lingered: would they survive the coming confrontation? As the sun set and the valley fell into shadow, the howls began again, closer and more menacing than ever. The two men stood side by side, weapons ready, their breaths steady but their hearts pounding. The hunt was on. The rise of the Dogman hunters. The confrontation with the Dogman marked a turning point for Etienne and Tahoe. The creature's relentless pursuit had forced them into a corner, testing their courage and survival skills. When the battle ended, leaving the clearing bloodied and the beast mortally wounded, they realized something profound. This was not just about survival. The Dogman was a creature of legend, a force that others might encounter, and they had proven that it could be fought. As the sun rose over the valley, the two men stood over the body of the slain beast, its massive form now still. Etienne looked at Tahoe, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "This isn't the last of them," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words. Tahoe nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We've seen the signs. There are more out there, and they will hunt, unless we hunt first." The decision was mutual and unspoken. They would no longer be passive trappers, merely surviving in the wilderness. Instead, they would seek out the stories, track the creatures, and rid the wilderness of the Dogman. The change in purpose gave their lives a newfound energy, one fueled by the adrenaline of the hunt and the hope of protecting others from the same horrors they had faced. They returned to Fort Carlton with the Dogman's severed claw as proof of their encounter. The sight of it drew gasps and murmurs from the traders and settlers. Whispers spread quickly, stories of the beast and the men who had killed it. Etienne and Tahoe found themselves both feared and admired, their reputation growing with each retelling of the tale. From there, their journey took a new shape. They sought out rumors of strange howls, claw marks, and inexplicable disappearances. Each new valley, forest, and mountain brought fresh challenges and new dangers. Thanks so much from Cryptid Monologues for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an update. And hey, while you're here, check out these videos. You'll definitely love them. See you in the next one.